Hey guys, welcome back to the Acosta E.T.F channel. I'm your host Lewis, and welcome back to Engineering Series. And in this series, we're focusing on PHP as a core technology. Before we dive into this lesson, there's 3 things that I need from you guys. Make sure you like the video. This will help our content be pushed out to as many people as possible who want to learn PHP. Second thing, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And third, make sure you turn on your notification. Subscribing and turning on your notifications will make sure that you get the latest content when it's available and ready. With those items out of the way, let's jump into today's lesson. Before we take a deep dive into PHP, it's always good to understand a little bit about the history so that way you can understand where PHP came from. Now, I don't intend this to be a history lesson on PHP and bore you to death, but I do at least want to give you some little bit of information so you can understand where PHP came from. So let's jump right into that. Now, PHP was created by a gentleman. His name is Rasmus Leerdorf. Now, Rasmus, if you ever see my video, I apologize in advance for butchering your name. I don't do well with names, but hopefully I pronounced it correctly. And so he crafted PHP from a set of Perl scripts, and he called them personal homepage, hence the name PHP. Later on, those scripts, he refined them and rewrote them in C, and that's what he compiled and actually delivered to the world, and it started to take off shortly after that. What PHP allows you to do is it takes a web page normally static in nature and it gives it the ability to be dynamic. Now, you may be wondering, what does static versus dynamic mean? Let's take a look at an example so that way you can see the difference between a static page and a dynamic page. Welcome to my Windows 10 desktop, where we are going to take a look at an example of the difference between a static page and a dynamic page. Now, there's a couple of tools that we're going to use. Keep in mind that if you haven't followed lesson 1, you need to follow lesson 1 in order to have the tools available to you. A link will be put in the description in case you need to follow and install the tools necessary to complete this lesson. So with that out of the way, let's jump into what is the difference between a static page and a dynamic page. First thing that we are going to do is launch XAMPP. XAMPP is our Apache web server. So I'm going to hit start and I'm going to search for XAMPP. And here we have our XAMPP control panel. Let's click on that. And we're going to start our Apache web server. Once it's green, our Apache server is running. In order to make sure that our example shows up in our web browser, we need to put our code in a specific area, and I'm going to show you where that lives. We're going to open up a file explorer. We're going to head over to our local C drive. You should have a directory called XAMPP based on lesson 1 where we kept everything at default. In the XAMPP directory, you will find another directory called htdocs. In here is where you restore all your code that you want to run on your web browser. And the Apache web server takes your code and presents it in the web browser. So here we have lesson 2 directory, and in here there's 2 pieces of item. We have our HTML and we have our PHP, so that way you can see the differences between a static versus a dynamic page. Let's open up both files in our text editor, and we're going to use Visual Studio Code for this, so that way we can take a look at what the code looks like. So we're going to open by right-clicking, open with Visual Studio Code. Here we have lesson 2 HTML, and let's open as well the lesson 2 PHP. So we're going to right-click again, open with, and we're going to click on Visual Studio Code. So there's a lot of code here that I don't expect you guys to understand right at this moment. When it comes to HTML, there's a couple things that you're going to see, and the first thing is you're going to see a heading. And this is where you have the tag h1, but the heading is going to say, hello, let's track the current time. And then in the paragraph, and it's denoted by this p tag, paragraph is going to say the current time is, and then you have what's called the time element. The time tag defines a specific time, or what's called the date time. And the date time attribute for browsers is used to translate time into a machine readable format. This allows browsers that can offer to add date reminders through a user's calendar, and a search engine can produce smarter search results. So it's not really a place to keep track of time. But what we're gonna have to do is input the time. And here I have the current time is 11:14. Clearly that's not the case, so we're gonna change that and put it to 11, let's say 40. And we're gonna save that. And let's take a look and see what that does. So let's open up a browser, and what we can do is type in localhost, and we see here lesson 2, which is our directory here. Let's click on lesson 2, and let's open up that HTML file. So as you saw here, we have our heading, hello, let's track the current time. And we see that here, hello, let's track the current time. And then in our paragraph, we say that the current time is 11:40. And this is what I mean by static, because I wrote here that the current time is 11:40. And as you can see here now that the current time actually is 11:41. So even if we were to refresh this, it doesn't change the time at all because it's static. We need to be able to have a dynamic way in order to update this on the fly. So let's take a look at the PHP side now, where we can use code in order to be able to dynamically update this time. So if we go back to our PHP code here, a lot of this stuff you can ignore. The biggest thing to focus on is this section right here, line 13 through 22. You have the start of PHP code. So this is the start, and this is how you end it. You close it. The first line sets your default time zone, so that way we can pull the proper time. We're going to bring up on the screen, hello, let's track the current time. And we're going to do /r/n in order to be able to put a new line. And you do that for both Windows and Linux. Line 16 is using the BR line break element. This allows us to put a carriage return in the text. And then we go into what is called a for loop in line 17. And the gist of this code is that we're going to do this set of code 5 times, which is going to say, let's bring to the screen what the current time is, and we're going to put a break in the line, and we're going to wait for 2 seconds, and then we're going to do this again, and we're going to do that 5 times. So let's take a look at what that code looks like. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up another tab. You can go to localhost, lesson 2, and we're going to run the PHP. As you can see here, just as our code said, line 15 says, hello, let's track the current time. You see that as the first line. And then we jump into what the for loop is, which is executed 5 times, and you see that done 5 times. And also you can see that it keeps track of the time every 2 seconds, as we told it to sleep for 2 seconds or wait. It's able to pull the current time, which is 11:45 and 25 seconds, and you see that it's updated every 2 seconds. Now, one of the greatest things about it being dynamic is that, as you saw with the HTML, once I refresh that page, it stays stuck there because it's static. It doesn't update. Whereas if I refresh my PHP code here, you now see the new time. And this is the dynamic part where it's able to give it more functionality than what HTML could ever provide. So now you have an idea of what static and dynamic web pages look like. You are probably asking, wait, there's still questions that I have. Like, for example, where do I put the PHP code? Or how do you put comments in your code so somebody can understand what your code is actually doing? Or what are those semicolons, or what about those semicolons? Why do you need them? Let's answer some of those questions for you. Now that we are back into the code, we can actually answer some of the questions that we had before. One of the questions was, where do we put our PHP code? And our PHP code can actually be put in a couple places. One place we can actually put it is within our HTML document, which is the example you see here on your screen. And you can see that in our HTML document, line 13, which is the start of our PHP code, and it ends in line 22. Another way to put in the PHP code is to take this PHP code that you see here, and we put it into a separate file, and that file can be referenced by our current HTML file. Now, we're going to tackle on how do you do that in another video, but in this video, you can see how we directly put our PHP code directly inside of our HTML document. The other question that we had was, how do we comment our code? When we are coding, we want to make sure that we leave breadcrumbs for ourselves in the future. I guarantee you 6 months, a year later, when you're looking back at your code, you're not going to remember exactly what you were doing. So it's always good to leave breadcrumbs for yourself. Also, it's always good to leave breadcrumbs for another engineer who might come in and maintain your code. So it gives them the ability to understand what you were thinking at that time. So let's do an example of how we can comment our code. If we were looking to do a single line comment // and this is the start of our comment, and we can say something along the lines of, this is where our PHP code starts. And this is what you would call a single line comment. Now, the good thing about comments is that they're not processed. So if we were to go back into our PHP code and run it in the web browser and we do a refresh, you can see that the comment never showed up. Now, what if you have multiple lines that you want to do in a comment section? So one of the ways we accomplish that is by using the / to open the comment and * to close the multiple line comment. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So if we jump back into our code, let's say we want to comment out our whole entire code that gets the time for us, and we don't want that PHP code to run. One of the things we can do is we can add a new line, and let's start a multi-line comment by /*, and we want to make sure that we close the multi-line comment. Okay, now in order to close our multi-line comment, we have to add now a * / in order to close it. So what we're going to do is right before the PHP code ends, we are going to add in a //. And as you can tell, that was able to close out our comment here. What it allows us to do is all the lines in between 14 and 23 are now commented out. So you can see here that the date will not be executed because it's considered a comment at this point. And so when we get to line 13, you're going to see here that the browser is going to understand, okay, I need to serve up some PHP code now. But then when it jumps into line 14, it just sees it as a comment. It doesn't execute anything. So what we should see now is an empty browser. And let's take a look at that. As you can see here, the browser is empty. Now, if we were to remove the comment again and we save that, we should then be able to refresh our browser. We should see our time executed again. And there we have it. Now, what about semicolons? So if we take a look at our PHP code again, you can see here, line 15, where I am telling our PHP to do something, I want you to use the default time zone of New York, and then I'm going to end it with a semicolon in order to say I'm done with this statement. So that's really the purposes of semicolons, and without them you'll actually produce an error. So if I were to remove the semicolon from line 15 and let's go ahead and refresh our browser again, you can see here that we have a parser error. You need to put the semicolon back in order for it to know when to stop executing the first command and when the next command comes. Once we put the semicolon back in, you can see that we're able to run the time again, and we're able to properly pull that up. So semicolons are very, very important. Now, I didn't forget about my Mac users. What we're going to do here is we're going to run the same code that we saw on the Windows tutorial, and we're going to run it in the Mac environment. In this particular section of the video, we're just going to actually see the steps in the Mac environment because there are some differences in how you do this on the Mac side. So if you need a refresher as to what we covered and what we went over, make sure you watch the section of the Windows portion where we break down the code and what each line means. So let's jump into how we run this on Mac. First thing we're going to do is we're going to bring up the XAMPP stack. So let's head over to our Launchpad and let's click on XAMPP. And once we click on XAMPP, we're going to start our services by clicking start. And now you see here that we have an IP address of 192.168.64.2. So that's the IP address that we're going to have to put into our web browser, which would be Safari. And we can see here that our stack is up and running because they're all green. Let's head over now to our volumes tab, and we're going to make sure that we mount our volume so that way we can be able to see the files that we need to see. Let's make sure that this is running. Let's open up Safari and let's type in the IP address of our XAMPP stack, 192.168.64.2. We can see here that our XAMPP stack is working. Now we need to be able to get our code on here. So let's minimize Safari. Let's open up our Finder, and we can see here that we have our 192.168.64.2. Let's open that up. We have the LAMP directory. We can head over to HT docs. Now there's a couple of things in here that comes installed by default. So what we are going to do is we are going to hit file and create a new folder, and let's call this default files. And let's stick everything in there because we are not interested in running the default files. We are interested in running our file. So let's go ahead and create a new folder. We'll call it lesson 2. So the next thing to do is let's bring our files and save them into our lesson 2 directory. So we are going to open up Visual Studio Code here. Now let's go ahead and launch Visual Studio Code in order to be able to type in our code and save it into the lesson 2 directory. If you remember from lesson 1, we were able to download the Visual Studio Code, leave it in the downloads directory. Let's head over to the downloads directory and we see Visual Studio Code, and let's go ahead and click that and launch it. Now that we have Visual Studio Code launched, let's open up a new file. Let's type in our code from our earlier example. Here is our code. So we're going to click File, Save As. So the location that we're going to put it in is the IP address of the server that we have running for XAMPP. So if you remember, it was 192.168.64.2. Go under the LAMP directory, then htdocs, and the lesson 2 directory that we created. And we are going to name this as lesson2.html and click save. Now let's go over to File, New File. Let's bring in our code for our PHP file. Now that we have our code, our PHP code in Visual Studio Code, let's go ahead and save that. File, Save As. Make sure we are still in the proper location so we can navigate to the location again. So make sure we click on the XAMPP IP address. Then let's go over to LAMP, htdocs, lesson 2. And we are going to call this lesson2.php. And we can save that. So now that we have our lesson 2 HTML and PHP saved in the directory that it needs to go in, let's head back to our browser, which is Safari. Let's head over to our XAMPP IP address. And as you remember, our XAMPP IP address was 192.168.64.2. So let's go ahead and refresh that. And as we can see here, we have our lesson 2 directory. And here is our lesson 2 HTML. Hello. Let's track the current time, which is 11:40. That we captured from last time, but we all know that that was a static page and that's not the correct time. So let's take a look at a dynamic page, which is the PHP code. And we can see here now that the dynamic code was able to pull the right time, which is 1:03 a.m. And you can see here that it's updating every 2 seconds like we wrote in the original code. And that is how you are able to run your HTML and PHP code in a macOS environment. Let's see how we run our HTML and PHP code on Linux. So the first thing we do is we launch our XAMPP stack in Linux. We are going to head over to our default directory, which is the op directory, and under LAMP. And we are going to run our XAMPP graphical interface by running elevated privileges on Manager Linux 64 run. So here we have our XAMPP stack. Let's go over to manage servers. We can see here that our web server is up and running, so that's good. Okay, now that our Apache web server is running, the next thing we need to do is we need to save our PHP code and our HTML code in the directory that we need to put it in. So if you recall, we are going in our htdocs. So let's head over into our htdocs directory and let's create a directory. We need elevated privileges. So now we have our temp files. So let's move all these files into our temp folder, and we're using our elevated privileges to do so. So let's go over to temp files, make sure everything is there. Let's head back up and let's make another directory, and we'll call it lesson 2 as before. And of course use elevated privileges. Now let's go ahead and create our HTML file. We'll call it lesson 2 HTML. Let's make sure we use elevated privileges. Okay, so we're going to use gvim in order to copy in our code and paste it. So here we have gvim, paste. So as you can see here, our lesson 2 is saved for HTML. Now let's save our PHP code. Now let's make sure that it was saved. Okay, so that was saved correctly. Now that we have our PHP and our HTML code saved, we can go ahead and run those two. So let's bring up our XAMPP stack. Let's click go to application. Launches the web browser. We can see here lesson 2. And we can run our HTML. And we can see here from before, hello. Let's track the current time. The current time is 11:40. Remember what we mentioned before about static pages. This is a static page, so the time does not adjust. And if we go back and run our lesson 2 PHP, if you remember from our Windows tutorial, this is a dynamic page and it actually pulls the current time. So you can see here that the time now is 2:03 a.m. and as you saw in the code before, you have an updated increment of 2 seconds. So 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10 for a total of 5 iterations. And this is how you run your PHP and your HTML on a Linux distribution. We just finished taking a look at lesson 2 in our engineering series on PHP. And in this lesson, we talked a little bit about the history of PHP and how it was created. Not only did we go into a little bit into the history, but we also took a look at some of the things in the code. And some of those things are the differences between a static page and a dynamic page. We also took a look at how you insert comments into your code and also as well what semicolons are. We also took a look at how you insert PHP into your HTML code, and we discussed different ways in how you can do that. If you found this video to be helpful, go ahead and hit the like button. Hitting that like button will push our content to other people around the world who are interested in learning PHP. Also, make sure you subscribe and don't forget to hit the notification bell